Okay, so this is your final lesson on this first section of the Arguments in Action unit. In this unit, so far, we've been looking at the difference between statements and arguments, the components of arguments, and we've recently been looking at evaluating arguments by looking at the premises in an argument. We've looked at relevance and we've looked at acceptability. So we've had a look at what makes premises accurate and acceptable and relevant in an argument. What we're going to have a look at in this lesson is this idea of sufficiency. What makes the premises in an argument sufficient to draw the conclusion? So what I want you to do is put the learning intentions to understand what is meant by sufficiency in philosophy and to understand the criteria for a premise being sufficient. Your success criteria for this lesson is to summarize what makes the premises in an argument sufficient to draw the conclusion in the form of a past paper question. So I must apologize first and foremost because I'm a little bit late in delivering this lesson to you on Google Classroom, but that's because I volunteer in the LOSI Hub occasionally with the frontline workers' children. So I'm a little bit late in putting this out, but that's the reason why. And also I should let you know that this week there will also be a mini assessment that will be posted on Classroom. I just want you to answer the questions and you'll get your result right away, hopefully, because the answers should present themselves to you once you've completed the assessment. So, first things first, what do you think the difference between saying something is necessary and saying something is sufficient is? So we're looking at the difference between necessary and sufficient. I'll give you a quick minute to write down a quick answer just off the top of your head. You don't need to have the right answer just now. It's just getting that kind of thought process in your head. What's the difference between something being necessary and something being sufficient? Okay. What you're going to do after you've done that is you're going to watch this clip about the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. So in philosophy, we talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. A necessary condition is something which has to be the case for something to happen. So for example, without any air, human life can't exist because we breathe in air and that's a part of what makes us live. So air is necessary for human life to exist. Sufficiency is when we have a look to see if something is just enough to be the case. So something is necessary, it has to be the case. If it's sufficient, you can look at it and say, okay, well, looking at this, this is enough for me to say this is the case. Okay. Hopefully this will become a little bit more clearer in a second. So sufficiency is like looking at what makes something perfectly balanced, exactly what is needed, no more and no less. Sufficiency considers what is necessary for something to be achieved or to be the case. In philosophy, the term necessary and sufficient conditions is used a lot to consider what is needed and only needed in many areas. For example, when we look at human rights, if we look at life and death, moral philosophy, looking at these kind of areas of philosophy, we use necessary and sufficient conditions all the time. And hopefully when we study moral philosophy later on in the year, when we're back in school, fingers crossed, you'll be able to see how different moral theorists in philosophy use necessary and sufficient conditions. So, the criterion of sufficiency is applied to ask whether the premises provide enough evidence for the conclusion to be drawn. If the premises are sufficient to draw the conclusion, then they are enough to engender a well-founded confidence in the conclusion, providing that the premises are acceptable. So, let's have a quick think. In the previous two lessons last week, you considered the acceptability of premises and the relevance of them. Basically, this is a kind of progressive way of evaluating an argument. To start with, you look at acceptability. And a premise is acceptable if it's reasonable to take it to be true. So first and foremost, we need to have a look at acceptability. We need to consider whether or not we can reasonably say that this premise is true or not. If we can't, then we can't really go much further, because if it's false, it doesn't contribute to an argument. Once we've established if it's acceptable, we look at relevance. So we've considered it, whether or not it's true or not, or if it can be taken to be true. If we can, we then go to relevance. And relevance, remember, is if it's relevant to the conclusion. So for example, if it provides support to the conclusion independently, or if it provides support through helping other premises. If your premise is acceptable, and if it's relevant, we can then consider if it's sufficient or not. So when we're talking about sufficiency, we're looking at whether or not the premises are acceptable, relevant, and if they are acceptable and relevant, if they provide enough evidence to draw the conclusion. We'll have a quick look at this. So this task is something for you to take a note on in a minute. I'm going to quickly explain to you how we can assess sufficiency. So, first of all, if we're going to consider if a premise is sufficient or not, we need to consider this first criteria. So the first criteria is this: the premise must be both accurate and relevant. These are both necessary conditions for making a premise sufficient, which means that if you have an accurate premise, but it isn't relevant, then it isn't sufficient. If it's relevant, but it isn't accurate, then it also isn't sufficient. You need to have them together. An example here for you. For a steak to be medium rare, it must have an internal temperature of 57 degrees Celsius. This steak has an internal temperature of 52 degrees Celsius. Therefore, this steak is not medium rare. So, in order for these premises to be sufficient, we need to consider, well, let's have a look at the first premise. For a steak to be medium rare, it must have an internal temperature of 57 degrees Celsius. This is accurate and can be taken to be true because research has shown, and through cooking steaks, through lots of people cooking steaks, that is, they've established that 57 degrees is a temperature for a medium rare steak. This steak has an internal temperature of 52 degrees Celsius, so presumably you've used a thermometer to do that. Therefore, this steak is not medium rare. So we've got the accuracy here, in that we've got the temperature of the steak, and we've got the statement that actually we need to have an internal temperature of 57 degrees Celsius. And they're both relevant, because if we look here, for a steak to be medium rare, it must have an internal temperature of 57 degrees Celsius. If we just jump straight to the conclusion, therefore the steak is not medium rare, it might make it relevant, but it can't work by itself. It needs to have this premise here. This steak has an internal temperature of 52 degrees Celsius, because working together, you have a stronger argument, or a stronger conclusion here, a stronger reason to believe the conclusion. So what you need is for the premises to be both accurate and relevant. Both of these premises are relevant because they support one another to draw this conclusion here. Your second condition is the premises must be enough to engender a well-founded confidence in the conclusion. So this basically means that you do research into the accuracy and the relevance of the premises. So with the accuracy, you say, well, okay, let's do further research to prove that these two premises here are the case. With relevance, you consider how relevant actually are they to the conclusion. So for example, the life expectancy of males in Scotland is 77 years. The life expectancy of females in Scotland is 81 years. Therefore, women are expected to live longer than men. Well, if we're going to engender a well-found confidence in the conclusion, we can do research into these two facts here, and we can also consider, well, exactly how relevant are these premises to this conclusion here. In this case, they're very relevant because the conclusion is looking at, therefore, women are expected to live longer than men. If all we have is the fact that females in Scotland are expected to live to 81 years, we can't really draw this conclusion strongly. Putting these two premises together, here and here, make both of these premises relevant because they support one another to draw this conclusion here. So we've got two very relevant premises, and if you research it with you can establish the accuracy of them. So when we engender a well-found confidence in the conclusion, we're just doing more research to suggest that this conclusion is true or false. And you're also considering, well, exactly how relevant are these premises? Right, so you're going to look at this slip of information, which is basically just a quick rehash of this, what I've just explained to you, but with a little bit more detail, and take notes on that, because that is going to help you when it comes to writing this answer here. So, your question is this: what makes the premises in an argument sufficient to the conclusion? Provide a definition of each type of premise. So they must be enough to engender a well-found confidence in the conclusion, and they must be both accurate and relevant. So these are the two conditions here. Basically, all you need to do is say one condition for a premise to be sufficient to the conclusion is this, another is this, and you need to provide your examples in between. So try and work out your own examples. You will get marks for obviously putting this example down or these examples down. However, it would be good if you started considering your own arguments. I don't mind right now, and maybe down the line we'll consider making up our own examples as a lesson. Okay, once you have done everything you need to do for this lesson, I want you to make sure that you've got all your notes for all the lessons so far. I believe this is the 5th lesson. I want you to have a look over them, and then I want you to take the mini assessment on Wednesday. For now, however, I want you to just make sure that you've got all this down. The assessment or the mini assessment will be live until at least next week, because I understand that everyone's working through 5 different subjects. So I totally understand that, you know, people will be working on the assessment at different times. But I'll be able to see the results of the test, and I'll be able to offer support where I can. So next week, we will start looking at formalizing arguments. And we may also start looking at some of the skills needed in philosophy. So for example, analysis, evaluation, coming up with our own examples, etc. If you need any support, please do let me know. I'm more than happy to help as always. And again, I hope this content isn't scaring you off philosophy, because like I've said before many times, it's a very interesting course. However, it is quite challenging to get some of these concepts down. Once you're back in the classroom, it will become easier because we'll be able to give support to you directly. So you'll be submitting this answer to show that you've done this lesson, and then you'll be doing the assessment for Wednesday. So wishing you all the best, and I'll hopefully see you soon.